Perhaps you saw the news story some days ago about a man who was coming out of the Walmart in Santa Fe, and he was looking downcast. I don't know what the troubles were, but 3 women came up to him and said, "You've got a bad spirit on you, and we can deliver you from that spirit." The man was sort of stunned, and they ushered him into their van and began to tell him that his burden was because of the things he had on him. So they told him to take off that very nice, expensive watch that he had on his arm, and then they told him to unload his wallet, which he did. And after they then did their sorcery over him, they sent him on his way, now not only discouraged by his family problems or his work issues, but having been fully denuded of his possessions. Now you wonder, how on earth could anybody fall for this kind of foolishness, this madness? And yet in a culture when we give up our connection to God, when we no longer have a prayer life, when we are overwhelmed by the burdens of life, we are susceptible to the occult. In fact, there was an interesting story about a man named John Gibson who said that it was the interest in power over the future that drew him in to the occult. He started dabbling with it at first, things like tarot cards, Wicca, and then he entered into pagan religion. For about 5 years, he then started an internet forum for these religions and became chairman of the, quote, Pagan Leadership Conference, unquote. And eventually, this destructive path, which again might seem absurd to you because of your relationship to Jesus Christ, but not so absurd when you abandon Christ and you go into the world, there will be false gods that will draw you in. Eventually, this John Gibson, by the grace of God and somebody's powerful prayers, had a conversion, returned to Christ and to the Catholic faith. And this is what he said, having worked from the inside of the occult. He says, from the inside, it causes unhealthy quests for knowledge and control of the future, even when it begins with mildly occult games or even jewelry. He said, quote, the more deeply you get involved, the more enticing it becomes. The inherent danger of magical addiction is that the more power you raise, the more intoxicated you get, and you start gathering more and more power for yourself, which takes over your life. What happens is you become a slave to the diabolical forces instead of experiencing the freedom of Christ. Now, pray God you are far away from any kind of occult practice. But the reality of false gods in our culture is real. As we loosen our connection with Christ, another power will fill the vacuum. We've seen it in public life. We've seen it in our schools. We have got to bring Christ back to the center of our families, of our community, and of our nation. One of the last great kings, a Holy Roman Emperor he was called, Charles V, was trying to defend Europe from the invasion of the Turks. This was in the 1500s. Europe had been divided, various nations, one against the other, religion against religion, but it was finally King Charles, along with the Holy Father, who was able to galvanize a united Christian front against the Turks, and, thank God, push them back. But King Charles, his chief advisor, was now sick and dying. So he went to the bed of his advisor, and he was deeply moved, and he said, my friend, you have been a faithful servant all of these years. Please let me now do something for you. Ask anything of me, and I will do it. And the dying man turned his weak eyes upon the king and whispered, Sire, there is one great favor I have to ask. And the emperor moved close to his friend and his servant, and he said, tell me, what is it? Give me one more day of life. Just one day more. King Charles' face fell. He answered simply, you know that I do not have that power. And then his friend smiled weakly and said, yes, I know. Even the greatest earthly king cannot give life. And now you see how foolish I have been. I have served you well all these years, but I gave no thought to my heavenly King. And now I must go to him with empty hands. Pray for me. And those were the last words of the king's friend. I must go to the great king with empty hands. Pray for me. Today, Jesus speaks about the final day when we will all stand before the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, Jesus Christ himself. And when that day comes, if we have been a faithful follower, not just saying, Lord, Lord, because anybody can say, Lord, Lord, even Lucifer knows who is Lord, right? But if we have been faithful, if we have persevered, as Jesus says at the end of today's gospel, if we have persevered and gained life everlasting, then when the Lord comes, we will stand erect, as is recorded in the Gospel of Luke, and embrace the coming of the King. And perhaps for most of us, as for the billions of people who have died through history, they already had the first judgment. They've met Christ at their death, like our beloved Father Samson this week. Even on his deathbed, Father Samson was dictating an article for the people of God from the Padre. He persevered in the service of his Lord. He didn't, for the last year and a half after he fell, broke his neck and was paralyzed, give up. He kept giving spiritual direction. He kept hearing confessions in bed. He served his Lord to the very end. What about you and me? Are we serving? And the world would say it's foolish, all this Christian service. Maybe you've been working to get out the vote for the ban on November 19th. Maybe you were standing and praying for the 40 days of life, and people laughed at you. People mocked you. But you did it anyway because you knew it's the right thing to do. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, Jesus said. They shall be satisfied. When the Lord comes, they will welcome him because their hands are full of the works that he inspired. The works don't save us. The works are our response. It's not enough to be baptized, to receive your Lord. You must also serve him, because you can throw the gift away. Maybe you've been involved in helping refugees settling right here in Albuquerque, who've come from wars like our wars in Iraq, or maybe civil wars in Somalia or Sudan, where the Christians are so terribly persecuted. And people say to you, we've got enough problems of our own. Why should we help them? But you do it anyway, because it is the right thing to do. After we have brought such tragedy to these nations, now we must give refuge. Maybe you're working at the homeless shelter, volunteering, feeding the hungry there, and people tell you what a waste of your time. You have a busy schedule, but you make the time because you know it's the right thing to do. And when your Lord and Master returns, and he says, what have you done to feed the hungry, to give shelter to the homeless? What have you done to instruct those in our faith, not only the corporal works of mercy, but the spiritual works of mercy? What have you done by your example? And when you share with him those works, he will say, yes, you are one of my good and faithful servants. You will have something to present to the Lord from your hands. You may recall, in the Soviet Union for, 70 years, it was illegal to do what we're doing today. You could not gather for worship. You couldn't even do it in your home if they should find out. But they did it anyway. In fact, what they would do on Sundays, many of the Orthodox Christians would gather from home to home. They changed the time each Sunday So it wouldn't be obvious, maybe 9 o'clock at one home this week, 11 o'clock the next week, 3 o'clock in the afternoon the next week, but they kept moving the time in order to be able to gather, pray, and worship the living God. There was one day when 2 Soviet guards burst into the home as they were trying to pray, and they had their guns and said, "Up against the wall with your hands up, all of you who will give your life for Christ." And there they were, up on the wall. And he said, "Those of you who wish to leave may do so now, and you will save your lives." 2 of them went off. "The rest of you, stand ready to give your life for Christ." 2 more of them walked out. Another 2 followed them. And finally, after the last challenge, one of the guards said to the group, "We're secret Christians too. We're sorry to frighten you, but we've discovered it's the only way to make sure the moles are gone, implanted by the Soviets, and now the real Christians can worship." They were ready to give their lives for Christ. They didn't know these 2 soldiers were also secret Christians. Now, I don't expect that that's the kind of thing that's going to happen to us in America, but if we ignore our religious freedom, if we do not stand up and fight for our religious freedom, which was given to us by our ancestors, it might even happen here. God forbid it. So thank God for the gifts you have received, for the gift of faith, and practice it. Exercise your faith so that as the Lord comes, you may be able to stand forward as one that he recognizes, with hands that are prepared, a kingdom that is not all about the self, but is rather other-centered. A kingdom that is not about my individual needs, but about the whole community of faith. A kingdom that is not about the secular wants, but it's about the sacramental realities. A kingdom that is not only about today, but is about eternity. A kingdom that is not simply about consumption, exercising retail therapy in the malls, but rather about worshiping the Creator of all good gifts. Then, when the day of judgment comes, it will be a day of grace. It will be a day of joy for the followers of Jesus Christ. Amen.